So about a week ago, I was praying for detachment. I wanted to learn more about detachment. I wanted to detach more from the conditions of life, which of course then brought to me one experience after another that helped me to detach. And not the least of which was my son, who turned 18 a couple weeks ago, and he's now gone to college. School started last week, and actually it starts tomorrow, but he had to go there to move into his dorm and all this. And he and I were on the phone almost every day at about 4 o'clock, and well, as the months have gone on, maybe a little less often and less often, but still we talked a lot, and we're very close. And I realized this is going to change. It's a big change. And what do you do when you have to face a change that causes you to release your expectations of outcomes, your expectations of conditions, your expectations of the opinions that you hold, the judgments that you hold, the opinions of others? What do you do to move, to detach from all of those outer-oriented things to the inner place where you truly have the spiritual growth? And I recognized that as the week went on, I had one experience after another that drew to me the lessons that are helping me to say, I'm detaching from outcomes. I'm detaching from circumstances. I'm detaching from my judgments and my attachment to the opinions of others. Attachment is the problem, and detachment is the solution. And when we move in a spirit of detachment, what happens is that we get to experience spiritual growth. And I'm going to share with you something, my balloons here, which have to do with detachment. The first balloon is you are here, pointing to the periphery. Now, many of you have gone to malls, and when you're looking for a store, name a store in a mall. Macy's. And you don't know where Macy's is, so you're looking for it, and you go into the mall, and there's a map there, and what's the first thing you look for? You are here. Where are you? Where are you in consciousness? Are you on the periphery? Are you in the attachment to outcomes having to be a certain way, or you're going to be miserable? That's called hell. Are you attached to the conditions of life having to look a certain way, or you're going to be miserable? That's also called hell. Are you attached to a certain way that people should think, or the way to influence them so that you can get them to see things a certain way in their opinions, or your own opinions? And that's all here. This is the you are here of the ego. And here's the you are here of the soul, which is pointing inward. This is where you detach from the outer circumstances, the outer conditions, the outer end results and outcomes, and the outer judgments and opinions. And then where do you move it to? You move it inward to the opinion of your own soul. Letting go. How do you do this? How do you move your judgments? And this is all about judgment. Attachment is a form of judgment. From here to here. How do you get the you are here to where you really want to be? Well, I experienced this last week, and this with my son. And what I did was I took him up the 7 steps. You know the 7 steps, and the papers are out at the lobby. I took him up the 7 steps twice. And I think I'm going to have to take him about 5 more times. I'm not joking. But I did the journaling, and I did the meditation, and I found and uncovered certain things that I needed to do with myself in order to move my consciousness. But what I found was, in order to let go of my attachment to this situation in my life of him having to stay 17 when he's really 18, stay in high school when he's really in college, I had to do some letting go. I had to do some release work. And I had to be what's called tough-minded and soft-hearted with myself. You got to be both. It's a balance point. It's about being tough-minded and soft-hearted. I am tough-minded and I am soft-hearted. Together? I am tough-minded and I am soft-hearted. And I was reminded of what happened when he was in a similar transition in his life many, many years ago, and he went from his training wheels to going without training wheels. Do you remember when that happened in your life? How many people can remember when you lost your training wheels? I can't remember it. Do you know why? I was reflecting on it this morning, and I realized I never had that experience. It's because I went from a tricycle where my knees were up to here and it was way too small for me, to a 10-speed bike with big blocks on it, because my parents, they didn't have a lot of money and they thought I could just make that transition. That's being tough-minded but not soft-hearted, and I ended up going to the hospital. And I realized, oh my gosh, because I was going to use this as an example, and how I handled it a little bit differently, and they were doing the best they could. But in this situation with my son, I said, now it's time for you, after it's been quite a while, to lose your training wheels. And he said, no, Dad, I'm not ready. I'm just figuring it out now. I'm just getting used to it. I said, okay, well, how long do you think it would take before you're ready? Oh, a month. I said, okay, well, let's give it a month. A month later, I said, now it's time for us to take off your training wheels. And he said, no, Dad, I'm not ready. And don't you feel like that when you're making a change in your consciousness? Don't you feel like you're just not ready? It's just too much? You know, Jane Hart said that you know you're in your ego when it feels overwhelming. And that feeling of, oh my gosh, I can't do this. And I said, oh, okay, I'll tell you what. We'll take off your training wheels today, and then in a week, if you don't like it, we'll put them back on for a week, okay? Okay. And he did fall down a couple of times, but in a week, I went back to him, I said, what do you think? And he said, I'll keep them off. Because he was ready to make that move. You are making a change in your life. You're changing and releasing judgments. Judgments of what other people think. Judgments of what you think. You're changing and releasing your attachment to conditions having to be a certain way for you to be happy. And instead embracing the conditions of life as they are so that you can experience the growth that you can welcome into your soul. You're releasing the outcomes in your life so that you don't have to have the outcome exactly this way, but instead the outcome can move for the highest good for all concerned. And that may be a little different than you had in mind. And the only way to do that is detachment. Detachment, detachment, detachment. One of the greatest experiences I ever had was learning something called the Serenity Prayer. How many people know the Serenity Prayer? Well, let's say the Serenity Prayer together. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I learned this because I was in a situation about 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, where I was in a supervised role and my supervisor was really tough. And I was feeling really hemmed in on. And so somebody suggested that I go to Al-Anon. And I started to learn about my own issues of codependency and how I was being run, trying to get this person to change. And I remember my prayer at the time, when I was first getting aware of this, was, oh God, help me to stand up to this person. And what came to me in prayer was, don't stand up to anyone, stand up for yourself. Whole different dynamic. And so what I found is I began to work week after week in this program and learning the spiritual principles. And here I'd been a minister for a few years. But what I learned was that I was the one who determined whether or not I was attached to outcomes, whether I was attached to circumstances, or whether I was attached to the judgments and opinions of others. And I used the Serenity Prayer to help me detach from the outcomes, from the opinions, and from the judgments of the circumstances in life. All of this is releasing judgment. All of this is releasing attachment. And one of the things that really helped me was, you know, I've been meditating for many years, but I took the Serenity Prayer and used it in meditation. We may do this at the end of the service, where I took the Serenity Prayer line by line. I'd say the first line aloud, I'd whisper it, and then I'd silently say it, and then just feel my way into it. What does it feel like? And then, of course, my mind would wander, and I'd take the next line. And there are 3 lines. And I would do that over and over again, and that was my meditation. But it was a meditation that helped me to detach from outcomes, to let things go. And in that situation, what I found was very interesting. I was in a situation where I thought I was going to have to stand up and say a few things. Well, you know what? For the most part, I didn't. For the most part, as I worked on myself, I just realized most of this stuff could just go by me. But every so often, I would I would act, and sometimes it would seem rather drastic, but it would be not coming from my ego so much, not so much coming from the you are here, but the you are here. So it's a different way of looking at it. And as I worked with this more and more, it not only was a benefit to me, but it also was a benefit to this person who went and got some help after I left. But in our situations, we have an idea in our mind about the way circumstances should turn out, how circumstances should be, conditions should be, and how everybody should think and how we should think. I think Jesus is a great example or template for how we can live. And you notice whenever people wouldn't get in alignment with where he was coming from, how he handled it most of the time, which was what I call the philosophy of non-interference. Now, the philosophy of non-interference is where he didn't go up to Judas, for instance, who had a certain plan for him and wanted things to go a certain way. And Jesus had been teaching for 3 years. He'd already said everything he could say. So he said to Judas, what you got to do, just do it fast. And he let him go. He didn't go, now Judas, I want you to understand, can't you see, if you really loved me, Judas, you would understand and do it this way. No, he wasn't codependent. I remember I had a couple once, and this popped into my head. They would take turns every week. This was many, many years ago. And one would come up and tell me, you need to tell her this. And the next week she'd come up and say, you need to tell him this. And they'd go back and forth, and I would just support them in telling each other. And finally she tried well, if you really loved us, you would help us. And I said, well, I love you too much to interfere with your healthy communication. And they finally worked it out, and I couldn't take the credit. Nor could I take the blame, but it's a way to support. So one of the ways that the universe supports us is that philosophy of non-interference, and we can support others with that as well. In Jesus' case, remember he went before the judge in the trial, and went before the chief priests and the leaders, and he didn't defend himself. They said, aren't you going to defend yourself? They were shocked. Now you'd figure Jesus, being a wonderful speaker and with wonderful, he would be able to come up with the best thing to get off the hook and say just the right things. But that wasn't what the highest good was. The highest good was very different. And he was willing to sacrifice take this cup from me, because he said, nevertheless, your will be done, not mine. So in our lives, where do we need to let go of that personal will? You say outcomes. I like outcomes. I like the outcomes to go my way. But if you really want powerful outcomes, and if you really want to plug into a greater, more powerful source, you let go of the outcomes that you have in mind. And you say, but I should have an idea of an outcome. It's good to have an idea of an outcome, but there's a time when you have to let it go and then open up to a higher good, greater joy, a better outcome than even you had in mind. Remember the Emmett Fox, and he calls it the golden key, and that is that philosophy that says when you're going through an almost unsolvable situation that's really troubling you, don't even think about that situation. Don't even work on that situation. Instead, take your time and spend your energy on just God. What's God? God is good, my connection with my higher power, and do that over and over again. And he said, without fail, it's going to work out for your highest good. But you got to let go of what your idea of the highest good is. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google the Golden Key, Emmett Fox, and it's a wonderful 1 or 2 page document that will give you this tool of releasing to outcomes. Another thing that came up in the last week, besides my son going away, was, I took him up the 7 steps a couple of times, and I was remembering what happened when my daughter went away to college a couple of years ago. I dropped her off in New York City, and I took her up the 7 steps, and before she got up, we were in a hotel room before I took her to her dorm, I cried my eyes out. I let myself feel. So being soft-hearted and tough-minded, and allowing yourself to release the feelings, to be authentic, and let yourself feel what it is that you're feeling. And then be open to the highest good, and then more joy came in, and then I could be present with her. In this last week, I had another situation. A bunch of them showed up. Just one after another. They kept coming down the chute. And I was just saying, okay, I'm ready for it. The next one was, I had to finish some forms on my condo, the townhouse that I'm renting. And it's a wonderful place. It's right on the Gulf. And it's 3 stories and it overlooks the Gulf. It's a wonderful place. But when I went into it and I looked at it the first time, there was ooze, there was gooey stuff coming up the floor. And they said there were new floors. And I thought, this isn't right. And I called them about it. And they just kind of danced around it. And I kept getting, sign the lease, sign the lease, sign the lease. Now, that didn't make sense to me. But I went ahead and I signed the lease. And I got a call day before yesterday. The guy said, you know, I listened to what you said, and it just didn't make sense to me. I said, well, and I went to look at it myself. I said, I'm glad you went to look at it yourself, because as I was describing it to you, I thought I was crazy, because it just didn't make sense. A floor that's oozing? And what is that? And he said, we're going to rip out the whole floor, and we're going to replace it with a new floor, and he's going to do all these things that I never could have dreamed. But I had to let go of the outcome I had in mind, which was he was going to handle it a certain way. And so sometimes when you have to detach from the outcome, you have to detach from, what are they going to think of me? How often do we get all worried about, what are they going to think of me? Jesus didn't worry about, what do they think of me? When he would speak and people weren't listening, he'd say, if you got ears, listen up. If you got ears, hear. And then he'd just let it go. So often we waste so much time trying to get everybody around us to understand. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't communicate, and that doesn't mean that there isn't a time for some of that. But in my situation many, many years ago, when I was going through that circumstance that got me into codependency in the Serenity Prayer, in that situation, I had to let go of my idea of what this person was supposed to understand, and most of the time, I just left it alone. And eventually, this person got the help that they needed. I wasn't their source. I couldn't take the blame, and I couldn't take the credit. So often in our lives, we've got to release these situations. How do you let go of the attachment to outcomes? How do you do that? By deciding that the outcome that you really want is the highest good for all concerned, the highest good and the greatest joy, the maximum growth, even if it means somebody's uncomfortable. My son is going off to college. He's going to be in the dorm. I have to let go of, ooh, daddy's got to protect him, and say, have you done this? Are you going to do this? Instead, let it go. So often in our lives, we want to manage, manipulate, and control the outcomes and the people in our lives, and we've got to let go. And again, the Serenity Prayer is one of the most powerful ways of doing it. Another thing we've got to let go of is our need for other people to have opinions a certain way or judge us a certain way. And just be willing to let people be where they are. I remember many, many years ago, a friend of mine was going through a real crisis, and I was so upset, and I went to my minister, and I said, this person is putting themselves at risk, at danger, etc. And she said, this is what you do. Just say, I release you to the God of your being and that God's guidance, and release myself to the God of my being and that God's guidance. I release you to the God of your being and that God's guidance, and I release myself to the God of my being and that God's guidance. And I did that, and I immediately felt a greater sense of peace. I wasn't so worried about this person. And they ended up having a situation that put them through a crisis, and they got the help that they needed, not that I did that for them. So often we get all balled up on what do they think, and our own judgments about situations. We've got to even let go of our own judgments and our own opinions. So what opinions should we attach to? If we're going to detach from something, we've got to attach our opinion to what? To the spiritual nature of our being, what we call the Christ of our being, our higher self. We've got to detach from this you are here, the ego's judgment, and attach to the soul's judgment, which is totally different. My ego just wants to be comfortable. My ego just wants what it wants when it wants it, but my soul wants growth. Sometimes uncomfortable growth. Sometimes growth that requires something of me so that I will grow into something more. And also for other people. I need to let go of my desire for everybody to have things according to my own dictates, Maybe they need to go through something, including, in my situation with my son. He's going to need to go through situations I have to let go of. And in your life, you've got to do that as well. We are not here to manage, manipulate, and control outcomes, circumstances, or opinions. And so for each one of us, one of the best places we can go is that center that you are here, that is right here. It's your heart. You have a good heart. You are your good heart. In your good heart are all the resources that you need to get through that situation. In your heart is that serenity that you're looking for. And everyone else has that same heart as well. And you can affirm that for them. So I just get that this is time for us to just move into our heart space. To just close our eyes and once again be aware of the heart that beats with such gratitude for this heart that beats in our heart, in our center. This tireless, selfless, wonderful center of us. And our physical heart is the outformation of our spiritual heart that is always flowing. And just as the circulation in our body is flowing life, so our spiritual heart is flowing life through and in us. We take whatever it is that we're dealing with, whatever changes there may be in our lives, and we bring these changes, this situation, into our heart space and align with the highest good for all concerned. We let go of our judgments and opinions or concern about the judgments and opinions of others, and instead we align with the Christ in us, the highest good, the judgments and opinions and approval of our own spiritual nature. We let go of the outcomes that we've had outlined in our minds, and instead we move into our heart where we hold the highest good, the greatest joy, that which blesses the most, even if it doesn't look the way the ego wanted it. And we detach from all the circumstances and conditions of life, knowing that every condition and circumstance contains the seeds of greater growth. And we move into our heart, which says, this too is God, this too is good. I am ready to see the blessing in it. And now as we move into this time, we just take our serenity prayer silently into our heart along with this circumstance and silently say our serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. The courage to change the things I can. And the wisdom to know the difference. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. And so it is. Amen.